109 articles. That was the scale of the prison code used across French Indochina. One rule instructed European employees to report all infractions committed by prisoners and indigenous surveillance. On paper, surveillance ran both ways. At Colonial, the prison had opened in 1862. More than a century later, U.S. lawmakers arrived on an official tour. Don Luce was with them, carrying a hand-drawn map based on information from former prisoners. In El Fortissimo de Sabine, the party left the prepared route and found the cells that would soon appear in life. The exposure made the prison visible. It did not make it disappear. This is the story of a prison that changed governments without closing and of what happened after the door opened. This is Colonial. The photographs were new to most Americans. The prison was not. Colonial had already been under prison administration for more than a century by the time the Congressional Party arrived. The sequence at the beginning is worth keeping straight because there was very little delay between occupation and confinement. French forces occupied the islands on November 28, 1861. On February 1, 1862, Admiral Bonnard ordered a prison established there. 65 days. That was the interval. The prison was not something added after decades of colonial government. Once every other solution had been tried. It appeared almost at the beginning. On paper, the order created a place of confinement on a group of islands off the southern coast of Vietnam. In practice, it created distance, water, controlled access, and an administrative boundary between the prisoner and the world that had sentenced him. And that was the point. The rules grew with the institution. By 1873, Colonial had its own prison regulation. Then on May 17, 1916, French Indochina issued the larger code that organized prison administration in 20 chapters and 109 articles. It dealt with staff, discipline, reporting, categories of prisoners, and the routines by which confinement became paperwork. Here's the part that matters for what happened much later. One of those rules required European employees to report infractions committed not only by prisoners, but also by indigenous guards. On paper, the chain of supervision reached downward and upward. A prisoner could violate a rule. A guard could violate one too. Both could be written down. In practice, a regulation can only show what the system said it was supposed to do. It cannot, by itself, show what happened behind a wall. That distinction would matter in 1970. The Congressional Visit did not arrive on Con Son as a raid, an investigation with warrants, or an attempt to seize records. It was an official visit during the Vietnam War. The route had been prepared in advance. 2 members of the United States House of Representatives joined the visit to the civilian prison, Augustus F. Hawkins of California and William R. Anderson of Tennessee. Anderson already carried a name many Americans could place without knowing anything about Colonial. Before Congress, Anderson had commanded USS Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine. In 1958, it crossed beneath the Arctic ice. A man associated with one of the most public American technological achievements of the Cold War was now walking through a prison complex most Americans had never heard of. Not quite through all of it. Don Luce was there as well. He had spent years working in Vietnam, and former prisoners had given him information about an area the official route did not include. That information had been reduced to something simple enough to carry in a hand, a map drawn from memory. The group followed the prepared visit until it did not. Then the story changed. The map led Hawkins, Anderson, Luce, and others away from the route they had been shown. What they reached would become known in the American press as the tiger cages. Photographs from the visit were published in Life on July 17, 1970. For an American audience, that date is the public hinge of this story. Before it, Colonial was largely outside the field of view. After it, the name of the prison could be attached to photographs, congressional statements, and demands for investigation. If you value documentary history built from records rather than legend, subscribe. The sources for this episode are listed below. But the wording around that moment needs to stay exact. The surviving record supports the public exposure in 1970. It does not establish that this was the first time American officials had heard allegations about the cages. That is a smaller claim. It is also the one the documents support, which is to say the question is not simply how 2 congressmen discovered a hidden prison in the middle of a war. The stronger question is what they had walked into. The cells photographed in 1970 belonged to a system whose administrative history reached back through the Republic of Vietnam, through French Indochina, and into the first months after France occupied the islands. By then, governments had changed, the prison had not, and the paperwork had been accumulating for generations. The early regulations are useful because they show intent in the language of administration. The buildings show something else. A rule can say who reports an infraction, who receives an order, and which office keeps a register. Stone records how many men could be separated, how high a wall had to be, how movement was narrowed, and how an institution expanded when the first enclosure was no longer enough. That is where the history becomes physical. The prison had been established. The next question was what the island was built to make possible. That came next. The first answer was scale. The oldest part was not hidden among the palms. Puhai began with a prison in 1862. In 1896, it was hardened into a permanent compound. By that stage, it covered 12,040 square meters. About 127,000 square feet, or just under 3 acres. Inside were 2 main detention ranges and 20 cells. The compound also held an infirmary, a chapel, offices, and work areas. Around them stood walls more than 4 meters high, a little over 13 feet, with guard posts placed around the perimeter. That was one camp. The measurement matters because the popular image of Congressional tends to collapse the whole institution into the tiger cages. Those cells became the image Americans remembered after 1970. The physical record shows something larger, a prison that kept acquiring new compounds, new internal divisions, and new ways to separate one population from another. On paper, each addition could be listed as a building project. In practice, every new wall changed how many prisoners could be held, where they could be moved, and how easily one group could be isolated from the rest. The architecture did administrative work. For more than half a century, the French prison system on the island was centered on its first major camp. Then the footprint began to spread. The local historical record dates the start of Bagne 2 to 1917. The word bagne was the French shorthand for a penal. Establishment of this kind? Construction did not translate into immediate use. Bagne 2 was not put into service until 1928. 11 years separated those two dates. By then, the prison code discussed earlier had already formalized categories, reporting chains, discipline, and supervision across French Indochina. The buildings gave those categories somewhere to go. A regulation could define separation in a paragraph. A wall could maintain it through the night. And that was the point. Another major compound followed. Bagne 3 entered use in 1939. 5 years later, in 1944, the local official history records that a subsection of Bagne, 3 and 2 rows of what became known as tiger cages, were already in use. That date changes the shape of the story. The cages photographed for an American audience in 1970 belonged to an architectural idea that predated that visit by decades. They were not a sudden wartime improvisation. At least 2 rows were part of the prison landscape by 1944, while the island was still under French colonial administration. So the question moves backward. What produced them was not one decision in 1970. It was a system that had learned over successive building campaigns to treat distance and subdivision as tools. First, the sea separated the island from the mainland. Then walls separated the compound from the island. Inside those walls, cells and internal divisions separated prisoners from one another. The layers kept getting smaller. That physical logic can be seen in the surviving French-era barracks as well. Scholarship on Pulo Condor describes large blockhouse rooms with stone sleeping platforms and the use of the barre de justice, a long metal restraint to which one or both legs could be secured. The device had come from older French dockyard prisons, which is to say, the island was remote, but the penal technology was not invented in isolation. It belonged to a wider French carceral vocabulary. Congressional combined that vocabulary with geography that did part of the work before a prisoner reached a cell. There was water in every direction. The result was not one prison building, but an expanding campus of confinement. A man could be moved from a collective room to a cell, from one camp to another, or into a work department without ever leaving the island system. The official Congressional history eventually counted prison departments for farming, brick making, lime production, sanitation, and other work. The prison therefore controlled more than where a man slept. It also organized where he worked and how he moved between those two places. Here's the part that matters for retention in the story. The tiger cages make sense only after the rest of the machine is visible. They were one layer inside a larger arrangement, and the larger arrangement had been under construction for generations. Not quite continuously. Budgets changed, building campaigns paused, names changed, administrators changed. The surviving record is uneven enough that a clean, year-by-year construction history would pretend to know more than the documents support. The measurable points are enough. 1862. The prison begins. 1896. The oldest camp is made permanent. 1917. Another major expansion starts. 1928. It enters use. 1939. Another camp follows. 1944. 2 rows of tiger cages are recorded in operation. The sequence is the argument. Each date marks another physical layer between the prisoner and the outside world. By the time American visitors carried a hand-drawn map through the complex in 1970, they were not entering a prison built for that war. They were entering the accumulated architecture of more than a century of confinement. But buildings do not tell the whole story. They can show dimensions, walls, cell counts, and expansion. They cannot show what a sentence felt like as 1 year became 5, then 10, then 15. For that, the record needs a name. The walls were finished in stages. The men who would live inside them were already arriving. One of those men was Tôn Đức Thắng. By 1929, French colonial authorities had sentenced him to 20 years of hard labor. On July 3, 1930, he was transported from Saigon to Côn Đảo with other prisoners. He would remain on the island until August 1945, about 15 years. That span matters more than a list of punishments because it gives the architecture a clock. When Tôn arrived, Banya II had only recently entered service. Banya III did not yet exist. The 2 rows of tiger cages recorded in 1944 were still years away. He entered one version of the prison and lived long enough to see the system at another, then another. The surviving biographical record identifies him as prisoner 528-9-TF. It also records work assignments that pull the regulations out of the abstract. At one stage, he was assigned to the rice hulling operation. By 1934, the same institutional chronology places him at Soluoy, where his duties included repairing machinery and driving canoes. That was the regulation. This is what the regulation meant. A sentence on an island was not simply a location on a register. It could determine where a prisoner slept, which work department received him, what movement was permitted, and which part of the prison administration controlled the next part of his day. The code supplied categories, the island supplied distance, the work department supplied routine. It is worth saying plainly what that meant for the men on the ground. A 20-year sentence could be experienced as thousands of ordinary assignments rather than one continuous event. A name could move from a transport list to a prison number, then to a work detail, then back to a cell. None of those entries needed dramatic language. The sequence did the work, and the sequence repeated. The later official biography of Tôn Đức Thắng records that his assignments changed during his years on the island. That source also attaches political activity to his imprisonment, including organization among prisoners. Some of the heroic language that later grew around those years belongs to memorial culture rather than to a neutral prison register, so it has to be handled differently. The dates are firmer. He arrived in 1930. He was still there when Banya III entered use in 1939. He was still there when 2 rows of tiger cages were recorded in use in 1944. He left in August 1945 after roughly 15 years in the system. That is enough to make him useful as a thread. Not because one man can stand in for every prisoner. He cannot. Côn Đảo held common law prisoners, political prisoners, and people processed under changing administrations across more than a century. Their sentences, work assignments, treatment, and legal status were not identical. Tôn gives the chronology a human scale. In 1930, the prison he entered already had decades behind it. The first compound had been in existence since the 19th century. A second major camp had recently opened. French regulations had been revised and expanded. The island had become a place where the institution could assign not just confinement, but labor, movement, and separation. On paper, those were administrative functions. In practice, they filled years. If this kind of institutional history is useful, A-like helps the channel reach viewers who stay for the full record. There's another reason to stay with Tôn through this part of the story. His 15 years cross the moment when the architecture associated with the later American scandal becomes visible in the historical record. That prevents the tiger cages from being treated as a disconnected discovery in 1970. A prisoner already serving a long sentence under French rule was still on the island when those rows entered use in El The timeline overlaps. That does not establish that Ton himself was confined in those particular cages. The sources used here do not support that claim, so the story should not make it. What the chronology does establish is that the French-era prison system had already developed the architecture later identified by that name before he left the island. The distinction matters. The record is strongest when it says exactly what can be placed on the same timeline and stops there. Toon's imprisonment supplies one set of dates. The building history supplies another. Put them beside each other, and the institutional expansion becomes visible without assigning him experiences the file does not document. By 1945, the island had changed around him. The prison that had taken him in during 1930 now included newer compounds and the recorded tiger cage rows. The wider political order was changing as well. Japan's surrender in August 1945 was followed by political upheaval across Vietnam, and Ton left Côn Đảo that month after approximately 15 years of imprisonment. His later life moved far beyond the island. He eventually became president of North Vietnam and then president of the reunified country. That later office is not needed to turn his prison years into legend. It matters for a simpler reason. A man processed by the colonial prison system in 1930 later occupied the highest state office in Vietnam. The file had changed categories. The prison, meanwhile, was approaching its own political transition. French rule would not last. The administration that had expanded Côn Đảo across the first half of the 20th century would eventually hand the complex over. That sounds like an ending. Not quite. He was one prisoner. The system was built for thousands more. He was one prisoner. The system was built for thousands more. Tôn Đức Thắng left Côn Đảo in August 1945 after roughly 15 years inside the prison system. The institution he left behind had already outlasted generations of prisoners, several building campaigns, and the political order that had first created it. 10 years later, another administrative change reached the island. In 1955, French Major Alois Blanc handed the prison over to the government in Saigon. The gates did not close. That distinction matters because a change of government can make a clean dividing line on a political timeline while changing much less on the ground. The French administration was gone. The prison compound remained, along with the cells, walls, work departments, and tiger cage rows built during the colonial period. On paper, authority had changed hands. In practice, the island still functioned as a place of confinement. The official heritage history of Côn Đảo describes what happened next in numbers. During the final 20 years of the prison, the complex grew from 4 camps to 8. Camp 5 was built in 1962. Then Camp 6, Camp 7, and Camp 8 were begun almost together in 1968 and were substantially completed by the end of 1970. 4 became 8. That is the institutional continuity hidden inside the political transition. The prison did not simply survive the end of French colonial rule. Its physical capacity expanded under the government that followed. The same heritage record attributes the 3 late 1960s camps to funding from MACORD, an American military and economic aid program, and says American prison specialists designed the expansion while the U.S. consortium R, M, K, B, RJ carried out the construction. Those are claims about funding, design, and contracting. They are not evidence that American officials directly commanded the prison. The chain has to stay that precise. A prison can be operated by one government, advised by another, financed through an aid program, and built by a contractor. Those roles overlap. They are not identical. In a story this politically charged, collapsing them into one verb would make the history easier to tell and less accurate. Here's the part that changes the scale again. Camp 7, later known as Phu Bin, covered 25,788 square meters, about 277,600 square feet, or a little over 6 acres. The surviving site record divides it into 8 sections. Each section contained 48 isolation rooms, 384 rooms in all. That is not a figure of speech. The number makes the late expansion difficult to treat as a minor addition. The French-era tiger cages had become the symbol that would draw international attention, At the same time, a much larger architecture of separation was being added elsewhere in the complex. Camp V gives the sequence another marker. The official site history dates its construction to 1962 and completion to 1964, making it the first new camp built by the South Vietnamese government on the island. 4 years later, the larger northeastern expansion began. The result was not the replacement of the older French prison with a new institution. Old compounds and new compounds operated inside the same island system. That matters for a reason beyond architecture. When the Congressional Party arrived, different generations of prison designs stood within walking distance of one another. A visitor could be shown a newer camp, a workshop, or an administrative area, and still never see the older cells that had given the tiger cages their name. Expansion increased capacity. It also increased the number of routes through which an inspection could be managed, and the construction did not occur after the scandal. It was already underway. By the late 1960s, Con Giao had become part of a wider South Vietnamese detention system operating during a war in which American money, advisors, contractors, and military power were deeply present. That larger relationship is too broad to compress into a slogan without losing the chain of responsibility. The prison itself gives a narrow route through the paperwork. Who owned the buildings? The government in Saigon operated the prison. Who financed specific new construction? The local heritage record identifies an American aid program. Who built the new camps? It names R.M. Shorta BRG. Different signatures. Same island. Ton Juk Thang is useful here one last time because his prison years established what the Handover inherited. When he arrived in El Futsimé with Loithine, the French system already had its first permanent compound and a second major camp. Before he left in 1945, another camp in the recorded Tiger Cage Rows had appeared. The government that took control 10 years later therefore received an existing penal complex, not an empty island waiting for a new prison to be invented. Then it added to it. The expansion also changes the meaning of the word hidden. The tiger cages were hidden from the congressional visitors in 1970 in the practical sense that they were not part of the route the delegation was being shown. But the prison itself was not invisible. It had budgets, buildings, staff, contractors, visitors, and aid relationships. The secret was not the existence of Con Giao, it was what an official visit could be prevented from seeing. That is where Don Luce enters the chronology again. By 1970, Luce had spent years in Vietnam and spoke Vietnamese. He had worked with voluntary and church organizations, and he had become a source of information for journalists and visitors trying to understand conditions outside official briefings. Former prisoners had told him about the tiger cages and how to locate them inside the complex. Information became a map. Tom Harkin, then a congressional aide, was also part of the visiting party. Harkin and Luce had learned from a former prisoner how to find the area that held the cages. The point was not to search the island at random. They arrived with directions. That makes the next sequence smaller than legend and more consequential than accident. No one stumbled into the cages. The delegation had an official inspection. Luce and Harkin had a different piece of information. Hawkins and Anderson were the two members of Congress willing to follow it. Somewhere inside a prison that had been expanding for more than a century, a prepared route and a hand-drawn route were about to separate. The difference was a few turns. The prison changed hands. The architecture stayed, and then it expanded. The official visit had a route. The map did not. Augustus, Hawkins, and William Anderson had come to Con Son as members of a congressional fact-finding mission. Don Luce was there as interpreter and guide. Tom Harkin was there as a congressional aide. The prison authorities could show the party workshops, compounds, and the parts of the institution prepared for inspection. Then the visitors left that sequence. Luce and Harkin had information from a former prisoner describing how to locate the tiger cages. The directions took the group toward a part of the prison the official tour was not meant to include. The route split. Contemporary reporting described efforts by both the South Vietnamese commandant and an American guide to keep the congressman away from that section. They kept going. What they reached were two low buildings containing rows of cells covered by bars at the ceiling. The visitors could look down from the catwalk above. Time reported 80 windowless cells and said roughly 4. 100 prisoners were being held in the maximum security section at the time. The measurements were disputed almost immediately. Luce and the congressman described individual cells as about 5 feet by 9 feet, roughly 1.5 by 2.7 meters. U.S. officials told Time the cells were larger, about 12 by 15 feet, approximately 3.7 by 4.6 meters. Those figures do not match. The disagreement belongs in the record because both claims were made while the story was breaking. The photographs settled a different question. Harkin had a camera. From the catwalk, he photographed the people held below. The images showed prisoners inside the recessed cells, some restrained at the ankles, with the bars of the ceiling between them and the visitors above. The pictures did not require a viewer to accept one side's measurement before understanding the structure. The ground was visible. Read enough of this paperwork and a pattern starts showing up. A regulation describes supervision. A tour describes access. A report describes conditions. Then somebody carries a camera into the part that was not on the route. The record versus the ground. Back in Saigon, Hawkins and Anderson gathered statements from former prisoners and began pressing the issue publicly. The official history of Hawkins in the U.S. House records that the two representatives drafted a resolution urging Congress to condemn the treatment of prisoners in South Vietnam. They also pressed President Richard Nixon to send an independent task force to investigate conditions at Con Son. That moved the story into Washington, but the congressional machinery did not produce one clean response. Contemporary accounts note that the wider delegation's official report gave limited space to the prison conditions. Harkin, dissatisfied with that treatment, released the photographs. On July 17, 1970, Life published them for an American audience. The hand-drawn map had become a national image. Time followed with its own account. Its report put the island's total prison population at about 9,500, while the maximum security tiger cage section held a fraction of that number. That distinction is useful. The photographs documented one part of a much larger prison system, not every cell on Con Son. The International Commission of Jurists called for an investigation. The government in Saigon sent a 10-member team to the island. Newspapers reported the statements of Hawkins and Anderson. In Washington, the House record preserved their demand for an independent investigation, even as the broader delegation's report treated the prison more narrowly. The same visit was producing two different documentary trails. One was administrative, one was public. That gap is part of the story. The official report did not erase the photographs, and the photographs did not by themselves rewrite prison policy. The two records diverged. They created evidence that could be cited, reproduced, questioned, and carried into later arguments over American assistance. For a system built around forms and inspection routes, that was a different kind of pressure. It had entered the public record. And this is where the title needs its most careful wording. Two U.S. congressmen did find the tiger cages on that visit in the ordinary sense that they followed information outside the prepared tour and reached the cells. The surviving evidence does not support a larger claim that no American official had known allegations about them before 1970. Public exposure is the documented hinge. That hinge mattered because it joined things that had previously existed in separate files. Former prisoners had testimony. The prison had an official route. American aide had